Well, I think we'll go ahead and get started. Welcome, everyone. I'm Dr. Ron Henning-Hockey. I'm the Chief Medical Officer here at the Reardon Clinic. And what a beautiful day and what a beautiful crowd. And so thank you very much for coming out to hear about a sweet topic given by a very sweet doctor. Now, normally you'd say, well, aren't you being a little bit uppity there, doctor, calling this doctor sweet? Well, this is a doctor that I've known literally her whole life. Dr. Ann is number 2. Doesn't mean that does that mean you've been trying harder for a long time? So number 2 of 4 children. We were very glad when she went and did her first year of naturopathic school at Bastyr. And then along came this guy, and she got wooed down to Georgia where they were married, and she finished her training as a chiropractor and was in practice there for a while. And then we were lucky enough to have her come and work at the Reardon Clinic. And as having her foundation, really I'd like to say you had your foundation in the Henning-Hockey homestead, because we have always tried to be a model. There's that old saying, I can't hear what you're saying because your actions are speaking too loud. So we've always tried to be example to our children without pushing anything literally down their throats. Did you ever feel like that we were trying to push you guys into health or anything like that?
I wouldn't say pushing necessarily. There were boundaries.
There were boundaries.
Which is a good thing.
And so certainly it's relevant to the topic today, because it's not to say that, matter of fact, we are not a sugar-free home. But what I like for people to think about sugar is that it is more of a drug than it is a food. It'd be similar to alcohol or something like that, to where you can easily overdo it and get yourself in trouble. As a matter of fact, my favorite thing is that I honestly never tell people not to eat sugar, because as soon as you try to force yourself to not eat sugar, it's very much like saying, don't think pink elephants. Well, hey, you're thinking them. You're having to think pink elephants to not think it. And so if you say, don't do this, you're going to get into trouble. And because people are going to try to focus on not doing something, and then lo and behold, you get lulled back to it. So anyway, I could go on and on, but I'd like to introduce Dr. Ann Zauderer today on behalf of the Reardon Clinic to talk to you a little bit about, is sugar bad for us? Thank you very much.
Well, thank you. It's always exciting to have a fun crowd. I think anytime we can get a large group of people that are excited to learn, that want to make changes, this is step number 1. And so, so everything we're going to talk about today, hopefully there are just a few nuggets you take away, a few kind of take-home messages that influence your behavior, influence your actions, or at least influence the way you think, because sometimes, as we'll talk about, there are things that influence our behavior that we're not necessarily aware of, stuff like our hormones, the physiology in the body, but your mind can override a lot of that. And so at least now that you'll know, hopefully that will help you make some better choices moving forward. And so when I sat down to write this lecture and write the Health Hunter article, I was trying to avoid kind of the inevitable eye roll that tends to happen sometimes when somebody mentions sugar, because sugar is kind of one of those topics that I don't think there's anybody in this room that doesn't know we shouldn't be over consuming sugar. That horse has been beaten to death, and you could in fact go into a kindergarten classroom and ask 5-year-old kids, and they'll tell you that sugar, too much sugar will make their tummy hurt or their teeth rot. So what I wanted to kind of focus a little bit more on today, is this question of, is sugar really bad for us? and when you get down to the crux of it, the answer is no. I mean, it's sugar. It's saying, sugar's bad for us. It's kind of like saying water's bad for us. It's, yes, if you drank too much water, you could die from that. But with sugar, especially glucose, is an absolutely necessary molecule in the body, for us to survive. And so, typically when we think of sugar, these are the things that we think about. We think about donuts and soda, and this is what the modern world would have us think of, when we think of sugar. And but if you were to ask our ancestors who didn't know anything about any of these types of foods, this is what comes to mind when they think of sugar, because these foods, all of these foods that are in this picture, these are whole foods, but they get broken down into glucose, into carbohydrates. And so so really in the modern world today, I like this quote by Paracelsus, it's the dose that makes the poison. And today it's the dose of the sugar that we're getting and the forms of the sugar that we're getting it in that really make it bad. And so what I hope to explain today is why the form of sugar we're getting is such an important piece, because I'll talk about the different types of sugars and how they influence the body and the physiology differently, and hopefully you'll be able to see kind of why that plays a big role in our craving for sugar. Has anybody ever gone out to eat? You have a big meal, you're totally stuffed, and then the waiter comes around and they're like, does anybody want dessert? And you're like, oh yeah, I could do dessert. Like what is it in us that thinks that we still have room for that? And part of that feeling satisfied after that meal, part of that those hunger cues, that appetite, those are controlled by hormones. And our hormones are influenced by the type of sugars that we're eating. So that's a little bit of a preview of kind of where we're going. This is just kind of a quick overview of some of the things we're going to talk about and where we're headed. We're going to talk about what is sugar, different types of sugar, diseases associated with the overconsumption of sugar, which some of those, we know, some of them I think might be a surprise to some people in here. How much sugar should we consume? What is the dose we should be having? And then if we're consuming too much, how do we start to eliminate that from our diet? How do we get back to that balance to where when we eat a meal, we feel satisfied? We don't feel like we need more. And so when we talk about what is sugar, sugar is essentially, it's a sweet tasting carbohydrate. It's not a coincidence that we love sugar. You could take a baby right out of the womb and they are going to love sugar. That's kind of instilled in some of the primitive parts of our brain. And part of the reason that is because sugar is quick energy. It's quick fuel for the body. So most sugars get broken down very quickly, and that's what our skeletal muscles and our brain cells, and really all of our cells, but especially our brain cells and skeletal muscle cells, use for energy. So of course it's going to taste good because there's a positive association with that feeling of having enough energy, that quick fuel. Like I said, glucose, it's the primary fuel for the brain. So sugar, what is sugar? Sugar is made up of, there's different types of sugars. We'll talk about these. Hopefully the terms don't throw you too much, but we'll talk about monosaccharides, disaccharides, polysaccharides. We'll talk about some of the specific types of sugars like glucose and fructose. And then one thing I want to mention, I'm not going to talk about this in detail today, but stuff like aspartame, sucralose, these are sugar alcohols. These behave very differently in the body. Even though they taste sweet, we don't have the same physiological reaction to the sugar alcohols. Even something like stevia, which isn't a sugar alcohol, it's an herb, again, still doesn't behave in the body similar to the sugars we're going to be talking about today. So the different types of sugars, I'll kind of go through this quickly, but this just kind of lays a foundation. Monosaccharides, the prefix mono means one, saccharides means sugar. So monosaccharides are one molecule sugars. These are kind of the basic building blocks for a lot of the sugars in the body, the more complex sugars. The two most well-known of these are glucose and fructose. I think everybody's probably heard those terms before. When you put those sugars together, those monosaccharides together, you can get a disaccharide. Di means two, so that's two molecules of sugar put together. Some examples of those are sucrose. Sucrose is cane sugar, table sugar, what we typically think of. Lactose, maltose, those are also different disaccharides. And then you have polysaccharides, and polysaccharides means many sugars. So these are many, glucoses or sugars. Those monosaccharides hooked together. And so when you look at the chemical structures of some of these are the monosaccharides. These are what the body used for fuel. In our cells. When you connect those two together, like if you connect a glucose and a fructose together with that one bond, you make the sucrose. So this is table sugar. And so this is, just, kind of as an example, when we eat sugar, we tend to think of that as a quick source of energy. And the reason that's a quick source of energy is you just have one bond here that needs to be snipped. And when you snip that bond, you readily have glucose and fructose now available, for the body to use as energy. When you consume something like a polysaccharide that has all of these glucoses hooked together, it takes a lot more, snip, 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 snip to get those glucoses into an available state to where the body can use them for energy. So these polysaccharides, this is typically what we get from a lot of fruits and vegetables. And this is why, they say, certain things are high glycemic versus low glycemic. High glycemic is a quick snip and boom, you have energy. Low glycemic is a snip, 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 and it's a slow release of energy over time. And then not to mention also that a lot of these polysaccharides are combined in foods that also have high amounts of fiber. With the fiber, slows down the absorption as well, the insoluble fibers. So I want to talk about, just, two specific monosaccharides right now. And the reason being is that the difference between glucose and fructose in the body is pretty extreme. And as you'll see here in a second, the amount of glucose versus fructose we're getting really has an influence on our hormones and our physiology. And so glucose is the body's preferred source of energy. This is what I said, this is what, when we talk about a high blood sugar, we're talking about glucose in the bloodstream. And glucose is what, insulin helps grab from the bloodstream and put in our cells, and that's what they use for energy. So glucose circulates in the blood. Most of the carbohydrates we eat get processed into glucose. It can be used immediately for energy. So as soon as it crosses the barrier, in the digestive tract and gets into the bloodstream, the body can almost immediately use that for energy. And then insulin is the hormone that's primarily secreted that helps us pull that glucose from the blood, into our cells. Now, fructose. Has everybody heard the term fructose before? Typically, we think of fructose as fruit sugar. Fructose, is naturally found in a lot of fruits and vegetables, but it is not a preferred source of energy for muscles and for brain cells. And in fact, fructose is the primary source of energy in the liver. So fructose does not circulate, in the blood to be used for energy in the body. It gets broken down in the liver. The liver uses what it can for energy, and then the excess gets stored as fat. So it's only metabolized in the liver, does not stimulate the release of insulin. And this is a really, really big point, is fructose is a more lipogenic molecule compared to glucose. So more of your fructose is going to be stored as fat, as energy for later. Which, when you look at, foods, which we'll look at here in a second, most foods, that occur in nature, like fruits and vegetables, have a combination of both glucose and fructose. And a lot of them, it's a pretty close to a 50-50 balance between the two. And that's a pretty brilliant model that, nature has come up with, because in one food you have the quick source of fuel, the glucose, but then you also have the fructose, which can be stored for energy later. Because for our ancestors that didn't have access to sugar all the time, sugar was only readily available during times when fruits and vegetables were ripe, which was during the summer, into fall. This was a prime time for them to store up energy so that when winter came and they didn't have an abundance of these fruits and vegetables, they had fat stored that they could use over the winter time. So in a very, very general terms, I kind of think of glucose as our energy sugar and fructose as our fat storing sugar. And the two, tend to, work in combination. And again, it goes back to dose. If you're having a small dose, that's a great model. But what we'll talk about is in the modern world today, we have an overconsumption of both sugar, glucose, and fructose. And so it's leading to a lot of the chronic diseases that we see. One other really, really important point about fructose is it has a relative sweetness of up to 1.8 times, almost, double the amount of sweetness that sucrose has. And so when you have that sweetness, we tend to want more of it. This is a big reason why food companies use high fructose corn syrup, is it tastes sweeter to us. And so, so they can use, a little bit less of it, and it tastes sweeter, and we want to consume more of those foods that have the high fructose corn syrup in it. So this is what I was mentioning. This is probably hard to see from where you're at, but basically this is a list of different fruits and vegetables, and this looks at the relative proportion of fructose. Fructose is in the red and glucose is in the green. So you have certain foods like they have on here, like a russet potato or a sweet potato, have much more glucose in them compared to fructose. A lot of these fruits and, beets, blueberries, oranges, a lot of these have about a 50-50 split between glucose and fructose. And then some of these fruits have a higher proportion of fructose compared to glucose. But as a whole, a lot of the fruits and vegetables, if you're eating a varied diet, are going to have about close to a 50-50 split between fructose and glucose. And then when you look at this is the comparison of fructose to glucose and a lot of the sweeteners that we use. So something like brown rice syrup is 100% glucose. Maple syrup, brown sugar, table sugar, honey, a lot of these are closer to 50-50. High fructose corn syrup it's 55 to 45%, and this is the information that's put out by the USDA. I read a few independent studies that say that the amount of fructose to glucose in high fructose corn syrup could be upwards to 65% fructose versus 45% glucose. And then something like agave syrup. Agave syrup is 80% fructose, and so that even though that's sometimes considered a more natural form of a sweetener, it's not one that I typically recommend just because it has such a high fructose content compared to glucose. So again, just to reiterate, table sugar that we eat is about 50-50 between the two, and then high fructose corn syrup is anywhere from 35 to 45% glucose, and then 55 to 65% fructose. So high fructose corn syrup, I wanted to talk just a little bit about high fructose corn syrup because high fructose corn syrup is a sugar that is, a man-made invention. It's used a lot in the food industry because it's cheap. It's much cheaper than regular sugar. It's much sweeter, like I mentioned, as a higher relative sweetness. And so, the food company, their goal is to get us to consume as much as possible. So they want things to taste good. They want to make it inexpensively, so the high fructose corn syrup is less expensive for them. And so because of that, on average, Americans are now consuming about 63 pounds of high fructose corn syrup per year, which is unbelievable. And they're getting a lot more stealthy about this. You have to be careful because on the label it always said high fructose corn syrup. Now you have to watch out for stuff like corn sugar. Corn sugar is another name for high fructose corn syrup. But this is a man-made, man-processed sweetener that's been used. And high fructose corn syrup kind of came on the market in the early 1970s. But you can see as they increased the trend of the use of high fructose corn syrup, especially, in the 80s and 90s when we had this huge low fat craze, where, for heart disease, everyone was told to decrease the amount of fats in their diet. Well, if you decrease fat in processed foods, you've got to make it taste good somehow. So they started increasing the amount of sugar in foods. So you can see right here, especially as you start to increase the use of high fructose corn syrup, look what happens to obesity, in the 80s and 90s, and this even goes to 2000. which, again, this looks bad for high fructose corn syrup, but just for comparison's sake, it's not just high fructose corn syrup. This is overall U.S. sugar consumption, and you can see same thing in the same time period. There's an overall increase in just sugar in general. And so I do think high fructose corn syrup, for a lot of reasons, is not the most ideal sugar, but it's not the only culprit. I don't want people to kind of get lulled into a false sense of security to say, well, I'm eating something that's sweetened with real sugar, so it must be better, than something sweetened with high fructose corn syrup, which maybe slightly a little bit better, but it's just right now we're over consuming sugar in general, no matter what type it is. So this is, I saw this, these maps as part of a presentation a number of years ago, and it made such an impression on me because, I think we all know that there's an obesity epidemic. There's a problem in our world today with obesity. But this map series I'm gonna take you through shows you just really how bad things have gotten, and not really just how bad they've gotten, but how quickly things have gotten so bad. And so this is a map that the CDC put out. It's a behavior risk, surveillance study that they put together. And what they were looking at is the percentage of adults that had a BMI greater or equal to 30, which, just relatively speaking, for somebody who's 5'4", that would be like carrying around an extra 30 pounds, And so, so if you have a BMI greater than 30, back in 1990, if you look at, most of the states were less than, or I guess most of the states were actually 10 to 14%. Some of the states were less than 10%, obesity. These white ones, they didn't have data for those states, and so that's why they're white. But, a lot of the states are at least, 10 to 14% of the population has, a BMI of less than 30. You go 5 years later to 1995, and now look at the map. So now not only do we not have any states that are less than 10%, we now, every state is at least 10 to 14%, and now half the states are 15 to 19%. 5 years later, that's not that long of a period. So then we go into 2000. In 2000 now, we've got one state, Colorado was hanging out there, they're the last holdout with the less than 10 to 14%. But again, half the states are now up to 20 to 24% of the population has a BMI greater than 30. 2005. Here we are again. Again, now Colorado's still the only holdout, 15 to 19%. We have a lot of the states now 20 to 24%, 25 to 29%, and then you've got a few down here that greater than 30% of the population has a BMI of greater than 30. 2010. Now we've got more of the states again in this highest category, and this is the last year I could find the data for. But if the trends were continuing at the same rate that they were, from 2000, 2005, 2010, we're in 2017. That's 7 years later. So this map, I wouldn't be surprised if most of this map is probably covered in red by now. So this is a really big problem, in our country today. And again, I wanted to go back to this map because when you look at this, again, with the introduction of high fructose corn syrup, this is the time period where things really, as the sugar is increasing, this is the time period when obesity is really, really skyrocketing. And this is, again, we have the percentage of obesity. You can see those trends that were fairly steady now all of a sudden start to skyrocket. And I want to be clear too that in this lecture, and this is my bias, I blame the food companies for this information. There is a certain level, I think, of individual responsibility that we all have to take, when it comes to our health. But I am in no way looking at somebody who is overweight or obese and saying, this is your fault. Because in reality, what has happened is we've had this infiltration of sugar into our food system, which we'll talk more about as we go, but we've had this infiltration of sugar into our food system, which has disrupted our hormones, and it set us up for a state where willpower is just not enough. We want to say to ourselves, okay, I'm going to do this, I'm going to stop sugar. But when you have your physiology and your hormones working against you, it's almost impossible. And so what we're going to talk about is not just quitting sugar and not just talking about what you shouldn't be eating, but what do you need to be eating to make sure that you can balance your hormones so that, you can break that cycle. So it comes down to this question of why. Why are we consuming so much sugar? And if anybody read the Health Hunter article, I said in that article, I don't think we're just a slave, to our whims, that this is just, a lack of willpower on everybody's part. I think that a lot of this, there's a lot more kind of going on underneath the surface that we're not necessarily aware of that is influencing why we're consuming, the amount of sugar that we are. So again, when we talk about the overconsumption specifically of fructose, again, to reiterate, it's cheaper than sugar, higher relative sweetness, so it tastes a lot better. We also, I mentioned earlier, we have a decreased amount of fiber in our diet. So our ancestors used to consume 100 to 300 grams of fiber per day, and we're getting around 12. And this is fiber from fruits and vegetables. We're just not consuming the amount of fruits and vegetables we used to. And now we can also consume a lot more in one sitting. Have you ever wondered, have you ever seen somebody with one of those like big gulps of soda? And if you think about that's, 84 ounces of soda, it's like, how can they even consume that much in one sitting? Well, these hormones are going to explain why you can consume that much, specifically of fructose, in one sitting, because it's disrupting our hormones. And it's disrupting certain hormones, specifically our insulin, leptin. Has everybody heard the term leptin and ghrelin before? Is that new for anybody? Is that kind of a new term? Okay, so a few people. So we'll talk about, what leptin and ghrelin are, and specifically how, fructose and glucose influence those hormones. All right, so to explain kind of how things have gone off, I want to talk about these hormones a little bit and kind of how they play into this whole cycle of how we eat. And so you'll have to forgive my diagram. I looked and looked for like a really pretty diagram online and I couldn't find it, so I'm like, oh, forget it. I'm just going to make it myself. And so I'm not an artist, so hopefully this makes sense to everyone. But when you look at, when we eat, and she's eating a salad here, which hopefully has, some good veggies that have, good carbohydrates in them. When we eat foods like this, and they get digested and they go into the stomach releases a hormone called ghrelin. And you can think about ghrelin as ghrelin is the hormone that grows our appetite. So when ghrelin levels are high, we're going to be hungry. So as our stomach empties the contents, as we start to run out of sugar in the bloodstream, ghrelin is the hormone that increases our hunger. So when you eat food and it goes into the stomach, that should decrease ghrelin. Makes sense that you want to decrease that hormone so that you're not hungry anymore because you just ate. So eating food in the stomach decreases ghrelin, which is our first kind of immediate hunger cue. This is kind of that immediately you eat a big meal and you are immediately not hungry. When that food gets broken down, it can be broken down, here into glucose and fructose. I'm just have these two for simplicity's sake. When food, gets broken down into glucose, glucose stimulates insulin, which insulin is the hormone that triggers, our cells to be able to take up that glucose. And when our cells take up that glucose, we get energy, specifically energy for the brain and for the muscles. Now, if you eat an excess amount of glucose, some of that glucose gets stored as glycogen in the liver and in some of our muscle cells. But all the excess glucose, if you had too much sugar, what's going to happen is that excess energy is going to get stored in our fat cells. And our fat cells, as our fat cells start to grow, they secrete a hormone called leptin. And leptin, as leptin increases, that I gave the term, it's more of a satiety that we get from that. That's more of kind of that long-term, not being hungry all the time sort of feeling that, you're kind of overall, your blood sugar is more, you feel more stable, you're not kind of constantly craving foods. That's an increase in leptin. And so that overall is just going to kind of decrease our appetite, overall. Now, if you look at, we also have this alternative pathway here when we consume fructose. And so fructose gets broken down, and fructose gets broken down in the liver. So the liver has the majority of the burden of breaking down that sugar, and, uses about 25% of it for energy, and then about 75% of your fructose, that excess gets stored in your fat cells. So again, if everything is working correctly, you eat, ghrelin goes down, hunger goes down, you use your energy, excess energy stimulates fat cells. That's a signal to the body that, we can decrease appetite. I'll talk about here in a second. Leptin also has a lot of other effects in the body. Leptin also affects our menstrual cycle, our reproductive hormones, because for our ancestors, if they're storing up fat and they've got excess fat, excess energy stored, that's a great time to reproduce. If there isn't food available in the environment and their fat cells are diminishing, that's not a great time, to reproduce. And so this is part of the reason why a lot of women who are female athletes don't have a menstrual cycle, because they don't have enough fat to stimulate the release of leptin, and so their menstrual cycle slows down. But leptin also has an effect on thyroid hormones, which makes sense too, because your thyroid hormones regulate metabolism. So if leptin levels are really low, it doesn't make sense for your thyroid to be going full gear. You want to be conserving more and not, just burning, a lot of energy, burning that metabolism. And a few other ones, it has an impact on blood pressure, heart rate. It has an impact on insulin in our immune cells, and even bone mass, and so leptin has a lot of different jobs in the body. And so when leptin levels get low, all of these things can be affected. And, again, looking at it in the context of our ancestors, this all makes sense. This is all, our ancestors' way of being able to communicate with what's going on in the environment. And if they have food, that's a good time for these hormones to be at play. If they don't have food, that's a good time for them to conserve. Now, part of the problem that we are seeing today is there is such a thing as leptin resistance. Has anybody heard of that term before? Leptin resistance is similar to insulin resistance. It's in my mind, I kind of think of it like the boy that cried wolf. We are consuming so much sugar, and so much fructose, and, storing up so much in our fat cells, and all this is happening so quickly that the body is releasing a lot of leptin, all the time. And eventually our cells stop responding to leptin. And so you go through all the feelings of having low leptin. So you might have low thyroid functioning. You might have problems with your menstrual cycle. You're going to have an increase in appetite. You're going to feel hungry, even though your body has plenty of fat storage. And so that is leptin resistance. And I couldn't find anything in the literature except for anecdotally to say I've seen this a lot, that a lot of times when you have insulin resistance, so if you have a family history of diabetes, or, if you can see in yourself some of the early signs of insulin resistance, that tends to go hand in hand with leptin resistance. And so, so if you have a problem with blood sugar, chances are pretty good you probably have a problem with leptin as well. So I want to take a look at this cycle again, but let's take a look at it in the context of today's diet. So in today's diet, this is what we're doing. We're chugging, the high fructose corn syrup drinks. So we are consuming high amounts of fructose, like our graph showed, much more, 63 pounds of it per year. So as we start to, consume high amounts of fructose, fructose does not stimulate ghrelin. So fructose has no effect on ghrelin. So when we have fructose, that's that immediate, it doesn't have an effect on our appetite. So that's part of the reason you can sit down and consume a whole bag of, donuts, or you can consume, a whole 84-ounce big chug of, soda, because you're not initially stimulating the decrease in appetite. Fructose also does not, stimulate insulin. Like I mentioned, fructose is broken down by the liver. It's not used for energy in the body. It's used for energy in the liver. And so if you are over consuming fructose, you're putting a huge burden on your liver to try and process all that fructose. And so what we're seeing more and more is, non-alcoholic fatty liver disease, which is essentially the liver, is under a lot of stress just because of an overconsumption of fructose today. And you see this in kids a lot. It's amazing the number of kids that have elevated liver enzymes because they're over consuming fructose. But as adults, one of the things that, putting that burden on the liver puts us at risk for is metabolic syndrome. So if your cholesterol, if you see your cholesterol kind of creeping up, especially that LDL creeping up, that HDL going down, triglycerides going up, that's not necessarily a reflection of what's going on with your diet and the fats that you're eating, the cholesterol you're eating. That's a reflection of the amount of fructose that you're eating. And if you want kind of more information on that, I would recommend going online, because we had a wonderful speaker back in February, Dr. Jennifer Jackson, who did a whole lecture on that topic and really did a great job of laying out the research. But if you are at risk, if your lipids are off, you are much better off decreasing the amount of fructose and the amount of sugar in your diet, and that's going to have more of a profound impact on your your lipid panel than decreasing cholesterol in the diet. So again, as we're overconsuming fructose, we're not decreasing our appetite, we're not stimulating insulin. And then the other thing is that fructose does not stimulate the fat cells to release leptin. So it's an interesting phenomenon, because you're storing 75% of this fructose as fat cells, so your fat cells are increasing, but they're not stimulating this release of leptin. So that feedback mechanism to the body that these fat cells are growing is also not there. So what ends up happening is we're hungry. So we consume more and we consume more, and this cycle continues, and we continue to put more and more stress on the body. And this is what starts to go awry. This is where, willpower, you can maybe stop, eating the sugar for a little while, but these hormones are extremely powerful with influencing, our hunger cues. And so eventually you're going to get hungry, and you're going to trip up. And, this is why, 95% of diets fail, because if we're just relying on willpower alone and we're not changing the physiology of the body, eventually that's going to break down. And not to mention too, because if you don't get these hormones in balance, that energy balance isn't going to be there either. So you could be restricting yourself to, a 1,200 calorie diet, but if you're eating a 1,200 calorie diet of all carbohydrates, or low fat foods that are high in sugar and high in fructose, then you're not going to be signaling to the body that it's a safe time to let go of this weight. And so you're not going to lose weight, and you're not going to, it's going to influence your thyroid. You're not going to upregulate metabolism. And so you're going to get stuck in this cycle. And that's where a lot of people get stuck. And then eventually they're just like, oh, forget it. And it just kind of becomes an inevitability for them. And so, so a lot of it goes back to kind of regulating these hormones, and a lot of the ways that we need to do that are by decreasing the total amount of sugar that we're getting, especially processed sugar. So these are just a few of the conditions that I wrote down that people may or may not be aware of that are associated, with this dysregulation, in our sugar consumption. Everybody knows about diabetes. I mean, that's on the rise, so I mean, that's a big problem in our world today. A big expense for our medical system today. Of course, obesity, metabolic syndrome, which I mentioned, which the symptoms of metabolic syndrome are, you've got the lipid dysregulation, so decreased HDL, increased LDL, and also I didn't put on there increased triglycerides, type 2 diabetes, obesity, hypertension, and cardiovascular disease. So if you've got the combination of these symptoms, those all make up what we call metabolic syndrome. And metabolic syndrome is a direct reflection of an overconsumption and a burden on the liver because of too much sugar, too much fructose. Adrenal fatigue. A lot of people, one of the hormones that I didn't include in this talk that we could talk about is cortisol. And cortisol is also heavily involved with, regulation of blood sugar. And so, when we're eating high amounts of sugar and our blood sugars kind of all over the place, that's going to be stimulating the release of more cortisol, which is going to lead to adrenal fatigue. Alzheimer's. How many people have heard that Alzheimer's, they're now starting to call type 3 diabetes, because there is such a strong correlation between dysregulation of blood sugar and the progression of Alzheimer's and dementia. So, so that's definitely something to consider, with the amount of sugar we're consuming. I mentioned the non-alcoholic fatty liver disease, and then proliferation of cancer cells, is another one that has been connected in the research with high consumption of sugar. So how much should we consume? This is a good question. And, I want to preface this by saying that everybody is different. There isn't a right answer for everyone, because somebody like me, I know with my family history that I have a much higher propensity for insulin resistance. I have a strong family history of diabetes. And so I know a little bit of sugar for me can do a whole lot of damage. And so what's right for me may not be right for somebody else. Somebody else who doesn't have that family history might be able to get away with a little bit more. So kind of use this not as an absolute, but kind of as a guide to help you be your own detective and figure out, what it is you need to eat to feel your best. But kind of as a rule of thumb, there's a doctor, his name is Dr. Robert Lustig, Lustig, and I would highly recommend if you Google him. He's got a YouTube video called Sugar, the Bitter Truth, and just a really wonderful presentation that he dives in really, really deep, especially with the fructose conversation. But he's done a lot of research. He's a researcher out at the University of California, and he says that your body and your liver can safely metabolize about 6 teaspoons of added sugar per day. So this is kind of the sugar that's like a man-made added sugar. He is not counting, the amount of sugar that's kind of intrinsically in a lot of the foods that we eat. So, 6 teaspoons is around 25 grams of added sugar per day. Now, some nutritionists and some doctors take that a step further, and they say, no more than 25 grams of total fructose per day. And that includes all of the fruits and the vegetables that you eat. And so that's a little bit more of an extreme recommendation. And some of the guys that are recommending this figure are people like Dave Asprey and Dr. Mercola that are real big proponents of more of kind of a ketogenic, high fat, sort of diet. And so that's taking it a little bit more extreme, but that's the figure that they're recommending. And to be honest, I would say that figure is probably a little bit more in line with what our ancestors, used to get. And so if you're wanting to be more primal and, kind of get back to our ancestral roots, that would be the figure that you could kind of use as a guide. And they typically recommend too, having the sugar later in the day. So you want to try and, your body is more insulin sensitive after 3 o'clock in the afternoon. So, any of the foods that you eat that contain sugar, your body's going to be able to best utilize that sugar later in the day. So if we keep, though, this in mind, that the guide, that we can safely metabolize, is 25 grams per day, I wanted to take a look at some of the things we are consuming. And, maybe you guys can see the print, but any guesses on a Coca-Cola, how much sugar? Yeah. So we're at 39 grams of sugar, in a Coca-Cola. So again, keep in mind that 25 figure. 25 grams is the maximum you want to get in a whole day. So that's not 25 grams at one sitting with one food and one meal. That's 25 grams over the course of the day, and that's what your liver can safely process. Gatorade, this is another one that, we think, my kids are in sports, they need to stay hydrated. We need to have Gatorade. 34 grams of sugar, per bottle of Gatorade, which is, again, if you're exercising, you might need a little bit more, but you don't need 34 grams in one sitting, especially when this is a drink. This isn't even, a food. This doesn't count any sugar, any other sugar you're having the rest of the day. Apple juice, so we think, apple juice, it's a juice, it comes from a fruit. Apple juice must be better. 22 grams of sugar. And this is a juice box, this isn't a huge thing of juice. This is 8 ounces. And so, in the apple juice, this a high percentage of this is probably fructose, so you think about with kids, this is in most restaurants considered the healthy drink, for kids to have. And I always tell, as a side note, I always tell a lot of the parents I see, when they ask, they're like, well, what if you take away juice and you take away milk, what is my kid gonna drink? And I'm like, water. They'll drink it. If that's all they have, they will drink water. And so, because you start to add this up, and you can see where it's not hard to get 63 pounds of high fructose corn syrup per year. All right, everyone's favorite, Starbucks. You guys aren't going to believe this. Maybe you will. I couldn't believe it. 60 grams of sugar. This is insane. You know, again, this is just a drink. This is not even the main event for the day. This is a drink. So we've got 60 grams of sugar in a Starbucks drink. Oh, okay. Now let's get into the health foods. Yogurt. Yogurt's a health food. And this yogurt, I've had this before. It's especially delicious. And I'm not dogging on yogurt, but when you look at this, 28 grams of sugar per serving. And I couldn't find it. This says per 8 ounces. I'm guessing that this is not just an 8-ounce container. I'm guessing there are probably multiple servings in this one container. And so most people, you know, if you eat the whole container, you could pretty easily probably double that figure. Cliff Bar, energy bars, you know, these are in the health food section at Dillon's. So, you know, so they sell these at Whole Foods. So these must be healthy, right? 22 grams of sugar, you know, in a Cliff Bar. And so, you know, so this is where it's sneaking into our food system. And we, you know, if you're not consciously trying to avoid sugar, you're getting a lot of sugar, more sugar than you should be getting. So foods with added sugar, you know, this list right here, this is all common sense. We know all of these foods have sugar, but this is a list of some of the other foods. Like I mentioned, yogurt, bread has added sugar, tomato sauce has added sugar, pickles, peanut butter, you know, the energy bars, anything low fat. You know, you could almost erase low fat and put high sugar, you know, because if it's low fat, it's high sugar. Otherwise, people wouldn't buy it because it would taste gross. You know, and the sports drinks. And so, you know, so these are all the foods that have added sugar that you have to watch out for. And you know, when you I looked up a few of these labels, you know, and like peanut butter, you know, might only have 5 grams, you know, of added sugar. But when you consider that, you know, you're having that peanut butter on a slice of bread with some jelly, you know, that starts to add up after a little while. And so all of this added sugar, and then, you know, these are the foods that we don't think about the sugar in. You know, this doesn't count the foods that we consciously know, like I'm having this serving of ice cream after dinner, that, you know, we know that has sugar in it. And so when you add up that total, we're getting a lot more than we realize. So how do we get sugar out of our diet? You know, and these are just a few strategies, and these are the strategies that are going to help balance out some of those hormones that we talked about. So number one is just be aware of what you're eating. Start reading labels, you know, and even better yet, eliminate processed food and cook at home. You know, I was at dinner with one of the other colleagues here, and she reminded me of this great quote. Michael Pollan, if anybody's familiar with Michael Pollan, he always says, you can eat whatever you want as long as you prepare it from scratch at home. Which I was, you know, you kind of think, you know, think about the number of things you actually prepare from scratch at home, that you don't start off with in a box or a package of some sort, and you know, you make brownies from scratch. It's going to take you a whole lot longer than going out and buying brownies at the grocery store, or even buying a mix, you know, and making brownies from a mix. And so if you make it from scratch, you know, that fits in with this 80-20 rule, you know, where if you're getting 80% of your diet from whole foods, not the grocery store, but real whole foods, you know, fruits and vegetables, lean meats, proteins, stuff you can buy when you shop the perimeter of a grocery store, you know, then you're going to be eliminating sugar from your diet. But as soon as you start shopping in the aisles, in the middle aisles at the grocery store, that's where all the pitfalls start to occur. And those are all the foods that have the added sugar in them. And not to say you can't ever buy those foods, but just be aware and start reading the labels. And I think you'll be shocked at the amount of sugar that's in some of those foods. And also take into consideration the quantities, you know, because if it says one serving size only has 8 grams of sugar, but you typically consume 2 or 3 servings of that particular food, then, you know, that starts to become a lot more significant and add up a lot faster. Cook at home. There's that. You know, cook at home. If you're preparing stuff from scratch, you're at least aware of the amount of sugar that you'll be adding to your food. Increase good fats in the diet. You know, this is something I know we've talked about in previous lectures, and, you know, once a month we do the food as medicine class, and I go into this in more detail. But, you know, if you're decreasing sugar out of your diet, you're decreasing a great source of fuel. And so if you just eat protein, you know, you're going to be hungry, you know, because protein, it actually does get broken down into glucose, but it takes quite a while. And so if you use fat for your fuel, then that's going to help stabilize some of those hormones. You're going to have the energy that you need, and you're not going to feel hungry. And so increase good fats meaning fats from vegetables, so like your coconut oil, avocados, olive oil, if you get grass-fed eggs, grass-fed meat, all of those good sources of good fats, MCT oil, all of those are gonna be good sources of fat in the diet. Drink water, so this is a challenge. Don't try not to drink anything besides water. Do it for a couple days and see how you feel. I've challenged a number of people to do that, and it's one of the easiest ways to drop 10 pounds. If you're used to drinking soda or you're used to drinking, a Starbucks, a couple times a week, try eliminating that. And most people, just because of the inflammation weight they lose, will lose 10 pounds just like that. So, so just drink water or herbal teas. Intermittent fasting is everybody aware? I've heard this term before, intermittent fasting. Intermittent fasting is one of the best ways to regulate your leptin and your ghrelin levels. And the idea behind intermittent fasting is that you go for periods, of maybe 12 to 20 hours where you're not eating. So maybe you eat dinner and then you fast through breakfast and then you eat at lunchtime. Now, the key with intermittent fasting is I wouldn't recommend it for somebody who's diabetic or pre-diabetic. And number two, you have to be really, really aware of what you're breaking that fast with. So if you fast for that 12 to 20 hours, you better make sure that meal you're breaking it with is a really good, high quality, high fat, high, whole food sort of meal. Because if you break it with a Starbucks drink, or if you break it with a McDonald's hamburger, then it's actually going to do more harm than good in the long term. Detox your liver. I'll put a shameless plug in. We're doing the 21-day detox program here starting in a couple of weeks. But, I recommend for everyone twice a year to go through some sort of a liver cleanse and detox. Give your body a break. Even if that's just eating fruits and vegetables for a few days. Give your digestive system a break. Give your liver a chance to start clearing out, some of these excess toxins, including fructose. We could consider that, a bit of a toxin in the levels we consume it. But at least twice a year, go through, a program where you can detox your liver and get that working kind of more optimally so that you can process, what we get exposed to in the foods that we eat. And then number 8, good quality sleep. Sleep, there are studies that show if you get less than 8 hours of sleep, that can have an impact by increasing your ghrelin levels by 15%. And sorry, I had that backwards. Decreasing leptin levels by 15% and increasing ghrelin levels by 15%. So you're going to increase your appetite if you're not getting enough sleep or if you're not getting good quality sleep. So these are all some strategies beyond just, of course, cutting out sugar, and cutting out processed foods that will help with regulating your hormones and getting things back in balance. All right, that's all I have. So we've got here about 5 minutes for questions. If anybody has any questions, go ahead and raise your hand and they'll bring the microphone around. Or if we have any questions from anybody online, we can go ahead and grab those too.
Now you take your cereals, I ate cereal too, but you take the sweetened cereal and the unsweetened, how much sugar do you get if you mix them together?
If you mix them together, so the question was if you're eating cereal for breakfast and you're having unsweetened and sweetened cereal and you're mixing them together, how much should you do of each? That's the question. Neither. I'm not a big fan of cereal for breakfast, just because a lot of sugar, or I'm sorry, a lot of cereals are high in sugar, even the ones that are whole grains. When you go back to the different types of sugars, the monosaccharides, the disaccharides, the polysaccharides, anything that's a carbohydrate like that is going to break down into sugar. So I guess the better answer to that is it depends. If you are kind of inching toward diabetes or pre-diabetic, or you've got elevated lipid levels, high cholesterol, high triglycerides, I would not recommend cereal as a breakfast option. A much better breakfast option would be doing something that's higher in fat, higher in protein, like doing eggs, a smoothie that's got greens in it, that's got flax in it, so something that is going to be higher in the good fats and the proteins is going to be a much better breakfast option than anything that's heavily carbohydrate. Like for me, again, using myself as an example, family history of diabetes, if I eat a high carbohydrate breakfast, even if it's something that is, considered a health food, like oatmeal, if I have oatmeal for breakfast, because of my blood sugar, I'm going to be hungry and my blood sugar is going to drop about an hour and a half to 2 hours after I eat it. Versus if I have a high protein breakfast of eggs, maybe some avocado, or if I make a smoothie with, protein powder in it, I can go to lunch no problem and not be hungry. So, so I would say, if you're working in the right direction, I would say yes, definitely decrease the amount of sugar cereal, increase the amount of non-sugar cereal, but that would be a good choice. A better choice would be, eliminating the cereal altogether and look for something that's higher in proteins.
That actually happened with our fourth child, who was in like the third grade. The teacher kept came to my wife and said, "Your son is falling asleep in the middle of the morning," and he was having a sugary breakfast cereal. Unfortunately, he and I went on a trip together. We listened to a book called Protein Power, and we asked him if he was willing to eat eggs for breakfast. And of course, eggs are coming back now. Eggs are one of the very best food you can eat. So he switched to eggs, and the teacher came to my wife a week or two later. "What have you done differently? He's so much more alert now." So it does not necessarily apply to everyone. There are ways to get good quality high fiber cereal, but you have to work at it, because most of the box cereals have fallen for the notion of we're going to go for addictive sugars, because sugars are addictive, and so people will start to use those, and it's so convenient. I mean, I know the cereal thing is so convenient in the morning, but if you want clarity and getting things done, I think eggs and, as Ann said, avocado slices, things like that would be very good.
Yep. Any other questions? Yes.
Would you say a little bit more about stevia? I mean,
Yeah.
say just a little bit more about stevia.
Sure. Yeah. So the question. Yeah, so the question about stevia, so yes. So on the scale of things, stevia is a much better option for as a sweetener, and I would put it in a different class compared to, say, aspartame or the sucralose. So yeah, xylitol's same as stevia. So those are much better options. Now the one thing to keep in mind, if and again, it depends on where you're at in your health journey, but even something that tastes sweet on the tongue, like stevia, it's going to stimulate an insulin response in the body. And so you will have, a bit of an increase because your body's preparing. It thinks it's getting sugar. So it starts upregulating and producing more insulin. And so I would say, just to sweeten your coffee in the morning or, a little bit here and there, stevia is a great option. And it's much, much better than aspartame or any of those sugar alcohols. But if you're looking big picture, if you're really wanting to quit sugar, that isn't necessarily going to help you on that journey. If you're still consuming a lot of stevia, like if you're having it in your coffee, if you're drinking the stevia drinks all day long, if you're constantly consuming it, it might influence your blood sugar enough that it will make it harder, to balance out some of these hormones long term. It depends on the person too. So, yeah.
I have one more question.
Sure. One more question.
You talked about fasting.
Yeah.
Is that likened to the cleanse type thing?
Yeah. No, so the question was, is the intermittent fasting kind of like a cleanse? And that's a great way to put it. It's kind of like, a daily cleanse. And what a lot of people that do it, they usually do it maybe like during the week, they pick maybe 4 or 5 days. They don't necessarily do it every day, but it's just kind of like a little bit of a fast to where you're giving your body a bit of a break. And so if you're doing the intermittent fasting, then maybe the full-blown, intensive cleanse may or may not be necessary, but it's a great way to fast. And another piece of it is if again you look at the ancestral perspective, our ancestors didn't always have access to food all the time, so they went through periods of fasting. And so that bit of hormesis, to use Dr. Ron, one of his new favorite words, that little bit of stress on the body of kind of fasting, it's cleansing to us, and it kind of acts like a reset, for some of our system. It helps reset some of these hormones. And, like for instance, our metabolism. If you are, say, 250 pounds and you lose 50 pounds, if you don't decrease your insulin levels, if you don't get into a bit of a ketogenic state, then your metabolism isn't going to reflect that weight loss. And so you're still going to be hungry like a 250-pound person rather than a 200-pound person. So, the fasting in likened to that is also the eating the higher fat is going to help reset some of these hormones, when you do start to lose weight. So,
Splenda.
yes.
I've been told use 1/2 of that in baking or instead of sugar.
Yeah. So the question was Splenda, using Splenda at about half the amount of sugar. And, Splenda is not one of the sugar alcohols we typically recommend. It's more kind of in the class of your aspartame, kind of like your NutraSweet, and those are considered a chemical. They take, a sugar and they add a chloride molecule to it so that it passes through the digestive tract. So it tastes sweet, but it doesn't get digested. But that can cause a lot of stress on the GI system. And, there's research that connects some of those sugar alcohols to neurodegenerative conditions and certain cancers. And so I would be hesitant. I would not recommend using Splenda as a sweetener. I would recommend xylitol is a good one. Xylitol is a good one. Stevia is a good one. If you don't like either of those, I would say a better choice would be coconut sugar. Coconut sugar is more low glycemic, but again, that one you still want to use in moderation. And so,
What about when you say good fat?
yes.
Is it better to cook with a good, more fatty, like roast beef
Uh-huh.
with the good flavor
Yeah.
and eat that gravy?
Uh-huh.
Is that healthy?
Yeah, so the question was with good fats, is it better to cook a more fatty roast and get those fats? The answer to that is it depends on where you get your meat. Because if you're getting a meat just from the grocery store, that conventional meat is from an animal that was probably fed corn. So it was probably fed a grain that's more inflammatory. And so you'll want to, so in that case, I would say no. I would look for more of a grass-fed, grass-finished meat. And if you could find that, typically, inherently, those roasts aren't quite as fatty because they're eating more of a lean diet. But the fats in that are going to have a much higher percentage of omega-3s, which is anti-inflammatory. So when I say good fats, the best ones are going to be from your fruits and vegetables. So avocados, coconut oil, olive oil, all salmon. All of those good omega-3s and 9s are going to be your best bet.
Okay, last question.
Last question. Yes.
You talked about doing a detox twice a year.
Yeah.
How would you do that?
Yeah, so a detox, that's a great question. So the question was, talking about a liver detox, how do you do that? So the liver is kind of a big filter, and the liver requires a lot of nutrients to not only process stuff like fructose, but it also processes toxicants in the environment, so our makeups, the lotions we use, anything that has toxins in it, if it gets into our bloodstream, the liver is what filters that. But the liver also has the responsibility of filtering all of the byproduct from our bodies. So when we break down hormones, when it has to filter through some of these detox pathways in the liver. So a cleanse looks like most cleanses you have more of a restrictive diet. So you're cutting out sugar, you're cutting out a lot of grains, you're cutting out a lot of the chemicals you're exposed to, in the foods that you eat, in the makeups or the lotions you use, and then you can, which that right there would be considered a detox. You're giving the liver a bit of a break. But then the next step is we have some supplements and some protein powders that help actually stimulate and support some of those pathways in the liver to help better break down, some of those some of those toxicants. So if you have a bit of a toxic buildup in the body, that will help with processing and eliminating those toxins. So for instance, the one that we're getting ready to do kind of as a group class, it's a 21-day detox, and it's the dietary changes I mentioned, plus you have the option of adding a protein powder that will support the liver in detox. So a lot of people, to be honest, feel kind of crummy the first couple of days they do a detox because you're pulling out a lot of the toxins that you didn't even know were there. But then, there's kind of a renewed sense of energy because, you're kind of giving your body and your liver a little bit of a break while also supporting clearing out, anything that's built up in your system. So, so it's just kind of giving your body a break, and giving it a chance to kind of catch up and eliminate all the toxins you've been exposed to.
How about we show our appreciation for Dr. Ann?
Let's see, and we do have a gift basket. We were going to go around and collect, if anybody's filled out the survey, we were going to go around and collect those so that we can draw for a gift basket that we have.
Dr. Ann also does every first Wednesday of the month from, is it the
11:30 to 1:30.
11:30 to 1:30, food as medicine. So she has a very comprehensive presentation that's interactive, where you can bring your questions and your concerns, talking about food, because really food is the foundation of better health. And so all of the other things that we do in the Reardon Clinic, still, it all begins with eating good whole foods and learning how to take better care of yourself. And then could you say a little bit about your detox program?
Yeah, so the detox program is it's going to be three Thursdays. We're going to meet from 5:30 to 6:30 on a Thursday as a group. It's limited to the first 15 people that sign up, but we're just going to walk through that exact question that's been asked of how do you detox? Because most people have kind of heard that term and they're maybe interested, but they've never actually done it before. So it's kind of going to be a group class where we'll all go through a detox, and then you'll have the opportunity in the class to learn about different different subjects related to detox, as well as get your questions answered about any symptoms you might be having, and we'll walk through together, what it's like to actually go through that detox.
Yes, ma'am.